The official story of Butler has a structural problem. Every time it tries to get stronger, something else around it gets weaker. That is where this story begins. Not with the craziest theory, not with the loudest voice. With a colder and more damaging fact, every major explanation now seems to carry credibility, costs the institutions involved cannot pay. That is the framework for the whole case. A structural weakness, because the real story is not that someone has already proved a hidden plot. The real story is that the official story has not become persuasive enough to dominate the event. And once that happens, the state loses the one thing it most needs after a trauma like this. Interpretive authority. Take the ordinary explanation alone would be assassin, a catastrophic protective failure, a terrible but isolated event. Fine. If that is the explanation, then it must bear the weight of every ordinary question the public will naturally ask. Why does Crook still feel so underexplained? Why is the motive architecture still so weak in public? Why does the digital record feel more disputed than settled? Why does the whole thing, after so much time, still feel emotionally smaller than the event itself? That is the first structural weakness. The ordinary explanation still feels too thin. Now take the incompetence explanation. Suppose this was simply one of the worst security failures imaginable. Fine again. Then the public expects one thing in return, visible accountability at the scale of the failure. If the state wants people to believe Butler was a gigantic but ordinary screw-up, it must punish itself in a giant and ordinary-looking way: firings, demotions, visible ruin. That is how institutions try to recover trust. But the public memory of Butler does not carry that emotional impression. It carries the opposite one, a gigantic failure and a strangely survivable aftermath that matters enormously. Because incompetence is only reassuring when the accountability looks more dramatic than the incompetence. If the failure looks apocalyptic and the consequences look procedural, then it was just incompetence that stops functioning as comfort. It starts functioning as insufficiency. That is the second structural weakness. Now, take the FBI explanation. The public was initially left with the image of Thomas Crooks as a figure with little meaningful public legibility. Then later reporting suggests there was a richer online trail, more activity, more connections, more digital substance than the public was first led to believe. Maybe not every claimed link is airtight. Fine, that is not the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is this. If the FBI knew much more than it revealed, then withholding becomes the scandal. If it did not know much more than it revealed, then the investigative weakness becomes the scandal. That is the third structural weakness. No route through the facts seems to reduce distrust. Every route redistributes it. Now take the foreign link question. Serious analysis here requires restraint. There is a huge difference between there are reasons this line should have been visibly exhausted and this line proves foreign involvement. The former is fair, the latter is often reckless. But politically, the fair question is enough. If there was enough context to justify visibly comprehensive investigation into whether any foreign linked threat environment had relevance here, why does the public feel so little confidence that it saw that work being done in a way it could trust? That is the fourth structural weakness if there was nothing there. The public does not feel that nothing was strongly enough demonstrated. If there was something there, but it cannot be discussed. Secrecy itself becomes another reason for doubt. Either way, the structure weakens again. Now take Trump. Trump is perhaps the hardest problem for the official story because he does not fit inside it. He is a man who revisits old grievances compulsively. He takes injury and turns it into durable narrative. He returns over and over again to whatever hurt him or angered him. That is his public style. Butler should have become one of the most frequently revisited scenes of his political life. Instead, he almost sealed it shut. He said he would explain it once and never again, and he came uncomfortably close to meaning it. That does not prove anything hidden happened. But it does produce another structural weakness, because once the principal victim behaves in a way that feels profoundly out of character, the public's emotional confidence in the story drops even if no new hard facts arrive. That is the fifth weakness. Then comes the footage. Again, restraint matters. Strange visuals do not equal proof of staging. Calm movement does not equal prearrangement. Photographers being directed into position does not equal script. Ordinary procedural behavior can look uncanny after trauma, but in a low-trust environment, that distinction is not enough. Because the footage is not dangerous only for what it shows. It is dangerous for what it symbolizes once people have stopped trusting the institutions around it. In a healthier credibility environment, ambiguous moments remain ambiguous. In a damaged environment, ambiguity becomes symbolic evidence. Calm looks rehearsed, order looks staged, efficient movement looks curated. That is the sixth weakness. The footage is not definitive, but the state does not have enough interpretive authority left to stop the footage from doing cultural damage. And that is the deeper pattern. Every explanation leaks, every answer destabilizes something else. Every attempt at closure exposes a new layer of incompleteness. That is why Butler now behaves less like a solvable case and more like an explanation trap. The state cannot fully satisfy the public because each lane of explanation now carries an institutional penalty. If it says lone attacker, the motive still feels too thin. If it says security failure, the accountability still feels too light. If it says the FBI handled it properly, the digital trail controversy remains. If it says foreign questions are unfounded, the public still does not feel those questions were visibly exhausted. If it says Trump simply prefers not to dwell on it, his silence still collides with his own public personality. If it says the visual oddities mean nothing, the public still sees a government that failed to earn enough trust to make nothing feel believable. That is the trap. And once a state falls into a trap like that, time does not rescue it, time worsens it. Because every month, without a stronger, more persuasive public account changes how silence is interpreted. Silence stops looking like complexity and starts looking like avoidance. Procedural caution stops looking like professionalism and starts looking like management. And when the official narrative starts to look managed, the public no longer treats doubt as fringe. It treats doubt as common sense. That is why Butler is no longer just a shooting story. It is a case study in what happens when institutions lose narrative authority around an event too large to survive without it. That is the real scandal. Not that every alternative theory is true, but that the institutions charged with defending the ordinary explanation did not make it strong enough to beat the alternatives. That is a profound failure, because the public can tolerate uncertainty if it believes the state is earnestly hunting truth. What it cannot tolerate is the feeling that the state wants the benefits of closure without doing the amount of explanatory work closure requires. That is the perception Butler now carries a giant event. A thin explanation, an emotionally inconsistent principal victim, a security failure too large for the accountability that followed it. A shooter still publicly underexplained, an official story that feels less like a conclusion than a container. And a country left to do the rest of the interpretive work itself. That is how public trust breaks. Not because everyone suddenly agrees on one hidden theory, but because more and more people conclude that the institutions involved are no longer entitled to the benefit of the doubt. Once that threshold is crossed, the official story stops functioning as the stable center. It becomes just another contestant inside the argument. That is where Butler is now. Still unresolved, not only because the facts are hard, but because the story built around the facts is too weak to carry them. And when the state cannot build a story strong enough to carry an event this enormous, the event keeps living, not as settled history, as active distrust. That is why Butler will keep returning, because the unresolved thing is no longer just a shot. It is the failure of the explanation itself. And once explanation fails, the crisis moves from the event into the institutions. That is a much deeper wound, and it lasts much longer.